Welcome to Our National Conversation, a podcast in which we discuss politics from all angles. We are completely nonpartisan, and all views respectfully stated are welcomed here. Our podcast is unique in that it is hosted and run by students who are focused on finding solutions to the biggest problems facing America.
My name is Matthew Reyna, and we are joined today by Tanya Ruiz Ortiz, who is our infrastructure team lead, and Sheng Zheng Mao, who is also an infrastructure intern as well with the team. Please, Tanya, go ahead and speak a little bit about yourself and how long you've been with ONC.
Yes, so I joined ONC early in the summer, particularly because I really believe infrastructure is intersectional. It leaks into most policy departments. So conceptualizing, illustrating infrastructural issues would really help us form policy that is adaptable, effective, and encompassing. So that's my passion when it comes to infrastructure and particularly water crisis, talking about water. Water is life. So it's imperative that we discuss how to improve water systems.
Right, definitely. Sheng, please.
Of course, thank you. So I've been with ONC for 5 months until now. And I also agree with Tanya that the infrastructure is definitely a foundational part of any society. And I am very excited today to talk about water and in particular water utilities.
Right. I mean, just going off of really quickly, something that both of you said is it's very overlooked is infrastructure, right? Whether it's facilitating business, whether it's just getting people from A to B, whether it's, building a hospital or critical infrastructure, flood control, dams, whatever it may be. There's a lot that's going on in the background in the lives of Americans, and pretty much every person that lives in I guess you could say in a mostly developed state. Infrastructure definitely is like you said, Shane, foundational to society in many ways. So just moving right in, we're going to talk about the first thing, which is the water crisis and its causes. So just to give a little bit of context to our listeners, we're talking about a water crisis in the context of the United States, correct? I see that in our notes here. Okay, good. Just wanted to make sure. So Tanya or Shane, whoever wants to go first. Tanya, I think, please go ahead.
Of course, thank you, Matthew. So we can all agree water is life. Potable water, how we shower, how we eat, how we cook with it. We need water for that. Even our companies, our factories need water to run. Even our new energy alternatives, they need water to run. So when we talk about the water crisis, it's more than just fresh water. It's also about the availability of water distribution and its uses. So by definition, the water crisis or water scarcity, depending how you like to say it, refers to the amount of fresh water availability that does not meet the level of demand. So what does this mean? It means the amount of potable water that we could use for a recreational use or for businesses, factories is declining. And an important aspect of this is that poorer and ethnic communities are particularly hit harder with this lack of water. This is a phenomenon, right? Because if we value water so much, why are some left without it? The biggest water crises are more prevalent in Las Vegas, Nevada, Honolulu, Hawaii, Rio Grande Valley in Texas, Jackson, Mississippi, Benton Harbor, Michigan, Baltimore, Maryland. One of the more notable ones is going to be Jackson, Mississippi. They were in the news showing how they can't guarantee when they'll get potable water, as in clean water, back to its citizens. So discussion rang again. How can this happen? How is water not a right? What is happening with our water infrastructural systems, right? The infrastructure report card has us at a C minus, and I'm not sure how you guys feel, but I never like to see C minus. I have never gotten a C minus in my life. So to have this so-called great country be having a C minus in water infrastructure is really telling, but how much attention we're not giving this situation. And the question of how bad is it? Like, should we really care? Should Americans really care about the lack of fresh water availability? And I say yes, because to illustrate it, we have two large reservoirs in the United States, Lake Mead and Lake Powell. They're almost at a dead pool status. This means that the water level is so low that it's not even flowing down to the people who really need it. And those are people in Nevada, Arizona, California, Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, and even Mexico, right? So without water to feed into electrical power, they're going to be left in a standstill because they can't bathe, they can't cook, they can't do common things that we probably take advantage of. Our 30-minute showers are a privilege to be having. These individuals may be having to less than 5 minutes. So that's something we have to talk about. And I think that really illustrates how bad the problem is. But of course, we could all talk about how bad something is, but let's talk about what has caused it so far. One of the main things is climate change. One of our own members here, Gabrielle Kilmov, a team lead here at ONC for the Science, Environment, and Technology Department, points to one of the causes being of climate change. By definition, climate change refers to long-term shifts of temperature and weather patterns, right? So that means in typical colder temperatures, it becomes warm, or in typical warmer temperatures, it becomes colder, right? Climate change isn't always hot. It could be cold. And the effect that has on our water is that it increases evaporation rates, right? When there's hot weather, our water goes with it. And also means precipitation. We have a lack of precipitation, so that means lack of rain. Lack of rain would directly affect our amount of fresh water because we could turn that rainwater into potable water. And she notes that according to the EPA, the amount of rain has decreased over the last 50 years. That means a lack of natural water, which is a direct impact on water availability to the public. But in terms of climate change, the US in particular, has been taking steps in order to improve it. But I feel as if water isn't something we're talking about as much, because typically when we paint water shortages, we think of third world countries. And we don't place ourselves in that situation. And I believe that really harms our discourse concerning the water crisis and how it affects individuals in like the South, more so in the East. I think that really needs to be discussed. Do you guys think that's something? Do you think we refer to the droughts too much to third world countries as well, or is that just me?
In a weird way, I feel that when we do think of like droughts, we do think, at least for me, I see what you're saying. I can definitely empathize with it, because yeah, when I think of a drought, there's differences. There's like a drought that's happening somewhere in a third world country that is like very, just horrible, for like there's absolutely no water anywhere and people are malnourished. But then for some reason, when I think of a drought here in America, I almost always think to myself, oh, that's unfortunate. We'll get through it though. No big deal. Next year it won't be that bad. It's a little weird to think of, now that you pointed out, to think of the differences and how we sort of manifest those thoughts in ourselves and through our own culture.
I think particular if you are in California, you've been surrounded about this, oh, we're in a drought narrative, right? Conserve, recycle, reuse. But it's interesting to me how that's become a norm, right? Oh, we're always going to be in a drought, so let's adapt to the drought, instead of thinking, what are the solutions to this drought? What can we do as a nation or as a state to combat this drought in order to increase our freshwater availability? But we'll get into that later. One of the other causes is water use habits, right? So this is taken again from Gabrielle's policy proposal here at ONC. She looks at how American water consumption looks like and how it can be adjusted. So what exactly is water consumption? Water consumption refers to how much water is used for activities such as agriculture, recreation, industry, energy, and household needs, right? It's basically the water we use for ourselves, for our recreational uses, or for businesses. The impact of this, when we consume too much, because we can consume a lot, we are depleting our natural sources, and our natural sources can meet up with this demand. She included a quote that says up to 50% of water used daily is wasted due to overwatering, overusing within businesses, factories, and homes. In particular, she notes agricultural water withdrawal consists of over 175.1 billion cubic meters of water each year. That's a lot of water that's not going back to the people, but in feeding into these businesses. But like we obviously understand how agriculture sector needs water, but there's some innovations that can be used in order to conserve the water they use or to put it back into the environment which they took it from. They took it from. One of the solutions, or a couple of the solutions she proposes, is investing in smart water irrigation systems, which I just alluded to, which is the usage of water data or soil moisture data to determine the irrigation need of the landscape. So it's smart technology in which these tech pieces can say, oh, this place needs this much amount of water. So we're not overwatering. So we're being cautious about how much water we are using, so it can either be put back into the environment we took it from or given back to the people. They also note that the second solution could be requiring family farms to install smart water irrigation systems. They know family farms because family farms are a big percentage for agricultural business, right? And before we tackle these big industrial places, let's start small. And we can build up then to show others that you aren't wasting money, you aren't losing your crops by taking on these new systems. The third one is to divert a percentage of saved water to areas experiencing severe water scarcity and areas likely to experience water scarcity in the future. So that means transporting water from the more like water heavy areas, the more drought affected areas.
You know, I could definitely see how the politics already seep into this, you know. So just from your suggestions, you know, putting in smart smart technology essentially to sort of track and basically place like thresholds onto people's water usage, I can get behind that very, very quickly, as long as there's no like, oh, it's automatically turned off for somebody's house or business or whatever it may be. But I often wonder, you know, while I'm definitely for that, what is the cost? I'm thinking about it in the context of today, right? Where the cost of living is increasing and everything's getting more expensive. Is now the best time to impose that sort of policy, the smart technology policy, onto people's homes, which inevitably it's going to be, okay, well, a person or a taxpayer, a family is going to have to shell out this extra money for that. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that there's or do you think there is the political will for it? Are there already programs that, you know, would help to, you know, take the financial burden off of, you know, household or small business, especially small businesses?
So Americans generally believe the water supply is becoming less predictable each year. And many believe we have to do something, but the main divide surrounds the willingness to pass bills to build onto water infrastructure, right? So this dynamic of money, that's always going to haunt every
Dynamic of
policy
money.
proposal.
Okay.
Typically, we see this pattern of Republicans not backing bills that would give money to water infrastructure, or they want to promote bills that typically would hurt our water availability. But this can be a biased perspective, given that the most news medias has painted Republicans as being anti-clean water or anti believing that water is an issue, right? But there are some Republicans have come out and say, like, no, we need to fix our water availability issues, especially given the situations in Jackson, Mississippi, right? You have their own governor saying, okay, we need to have these changes, but we just don't have the money, right? So we have a problem. We know the solution, but they're just not coming together because of this idea of money. But my thing is, everything is always going to come with a cost. Either we do this cost now or wait 10 years and the cost is going to be 50 times higher than it's supposed to be. But also, I believe there's this misconception that these smart water technologies are really expensive. But it's much like how we believe solar technology, like not solar technology, so energy alternative technologies to be super expensive. when they're not. They've been painted to be. I don't have the figure right in my head, but I know it's not as expensive as we typically paint it to be, which is a shame. But this has to do with the coverage these technologies get. They're not in the mainstream media. And I believe Americans should be aware that there are technologies out there that can help alleviate their water crisis situation going on. But it comes down to talking about it and making people aware that these options exist. We just need to bring them into the news, into the mainstream, really. One of the other solutions that Gabriella points to is enforcing emergency water regulation requirements nationwide. So we kind of have this already, this idea of conservation, right? But it's not really enforced on the level it ought to be. It's rather a suggestion as opposed to something that's like by law. I mean, California's a bit different. California has a law where you're not allowed to use water after 8 p.m., I believe, like the water sprinklers. So this could be something that's imposed everywhere. So we're all as a whole saving water as opposed to some counties doing it or just one state doing it. But you can look us up at ournationalconversation.org to find out more about Gabriella's solutions, in which she goes into impressive detail on what these mean on the local levels.
Okay, so bringing that all to California, we're in California. The water crisis is most pronounced. Farming accounts for about 40% of California's total water usage. So let's start there. How does agriculture use water, and how can it help to conserve it? Thank
So
you, Tanya.
agriculture accounts for approximately 80% of the United States consumption of water and over 90% in Maine and Western states. So what does this mean? It means that they use, like the agriculture industry uses the bulk of our potable water, as in our clean water for their products, which makes sense. They need a lot of water to feed into the industry because without water, we're not getting crops back into us. We're not getting food or product that makes our food that we like to eat. We understand this. We also understand, though, there are impressive innovations that can help these agricultural businesses save water. And this is something that Gabrielle did touch on having smart irrigation systems and requiring family farms to install these smart irrigation systems because they're detailing on how to save water in those finer details, right? But also an interesting technique that's being offered is returning water to the rivers as a proposed conservation technique, right? So that means when they have this excess water, instead of just like not using it, it's going to be putting back into the land. So this sort of give and take relationship, they take a lot, but those are going to give back a lot. But also, we also have to remember like when these businesses, even though they're helping us, fueling our bodies, they also have to be cautious of how much water they're using. I feel as if these agriculture businesses are being too free with how they use water and how much excess water is being put back, because when they have too much water, they're expelling it back in the land, which is putting pollutants back into the land, right? And we believe that, well, I believe, I guess, biased perspective, that when we use these smart water technologies, they can be returning water the way it ought to be returned to the people, right? Instead of just keeping it and storing for themselves, which isn't fair at all, but nothing is fair, right?
And what you mean by the pollutants, you're talking about the fertilizer, all of everything that basically goes into the agricultural supply chain to increase our yield, that when you overwater or when you use too much water for a specific area and the drainage comes off, it takes a lot of that fertilizer chemicals, puts it back into the what is it called? The groundwater, things like that. Yeah, understood.
Yes, it's the runoff. So when they use too much water, they're creating runoff, which is, think of it as streams of water that are carrying these pollutants back into the land where they're growing your food in, right? But if you have these smart water technologies, they're giving the plants exactly what they need, not too much. So we're reducing this runoff and reducing the pollutants that are being put back into the land, which is good. Who wants a lot of pollutants in their food or in their clean water? No one. But if we have the technology that could fix this, why aren't we using this? But again, it comes back to the idea of money. This idea of like, oh, it must cost so much money to have this. But no, really, when we bring this into the mainstream, we're going to create more innovation surrounding this. So the cost will go down if it's not already down already.
I'm not sure if you plan on taking the conversation in this direction, but what do water rights have to do with these things? So, there's from my own knowledge of the Central Valley and some of the practices going on there, um, it's sort of like that whole thought that if you don't use what's given to you this year and you have something left over, then that leftover amount will be taken from you, so you won't have that extra next year. Right. Is that something that happens here in the Central Valley when it comes to watering practices, which is what helps to contribute to them overwatering, as opposed to saying, yeah, we don't need this water, so then they give it back to the state, or you said the people, but then they won't receive that amount of water next year. Do you know if that's a factor here?
I think that's an interesting point that I have yet to research, but I know there are some city sanctions that don't allow you to hold on to water,
Hmm.
right? In the county I'm in, we're not allowed to hold rainwater, right? Because it's looked as unclean water. So
Hmm.
maybe that's something other cities are seeing. But this idea of water as a right, this is an interesting subsection of the water crisis because 12 years ago, the United Nations recognized water as a human right, but the US abstained from that vote,
Hmm.
even going as far as arguing against the resolution. So this is really interesting how if we don't view water as a right, like clean water as a right, then we're not going to put the systems in place in order to fix our water systems. So it seems to me as if we were to make water a right in the United States, we can see conversations and innovations happening concerning the water infrastructural system. Recognizing that water is a right is essential to human life because it improves our water regulation systems and paves the way to make other essential utilities a right as well. But again, that's my own perspective. How, you know, it's not only water, it's internet, right?
Hmm.
As a right that we have because it really impacts the way how we interact with society. California and New York have recognized the right to water, but this is something all states should be doing. Even I would even say on a federal thing, like make water a right at this point because we all need it to survive. And if we're having sectors who are really abusing the amount of water they have, and it's not going back to the people, or the people are seeing droughts that they're slowly being affected, or people are seeing unclean water like Flint, Michigan, where they're still having water issues. It's just brown spewage coming out of their faucets. We
Hmm.
need to discuss this as well, but that itself can be another podcast on making water a right.
Right. Yeah, no, that is something that I personally do want to listen to. That's going to have to be another topic or another podcast because yeah, what's happening in Flint and for how long it's been happening and the reasons why it's been happening for as long as it has is definitely something worthy of national attention. I'm really surprised that it's still not popping up in the US conscience. So then talk to us about the desalinization plants. I have a little bit of knowledge on that, but and I'm of mixed feelings about that as well. But Tanya or Shane, if you can explain to us what the desalinization plants are, um, why is there some hesitation to implement them more? What are the benefits, the drawbacks?
So, our traditional water conservation techniques all have their setbacks, right? There's apparently no good way to conserve water. So, when we look at desalination plants, they use osmosis to separate drinkable water molecules from salty seawater, right? So, converting our salt water into drinkable water, which is amazing in itself. It's an amazing innovation, but they are powered by fossil fuel generated electricity. And their leftover water, if not appropriately returned to the sea, result in depletion of ocean oxygen. So that means our coral reefs are being damaged, right? Because they can't sustain that level of salt and lack of good chemicals within their water, which is being pushed back from these plants. So that's one of their main criticisms, is that they say they're fixing the situation, but they're creating two more other problems of pollution, and they hurt the environment they surround. And this other idea is water conservation, right? So individuals taking the choice or making the choice to conserve water. But again, it's not really mandatory and relies on the discretion of individuals. So it doesn't meet the level of conservation as we would want it to do, right? So the other one is dams. To fix the water crisis, people point to dams. And dams store water in a reservoir and release it during dry periods with low flows. But with climate change, dams risk higher evaporation rates, right? When you're storing water in a concrete cylinder and it's really hot, the water is going to evaporate. And a lot of these dams are becoming very dry. So when dry seasons comes, we're still not going to have any water. So this begets the question of what can we do then in order to bring water to more drought-stricken states and lessen the amount of water from overly watered states. Like some states are more prone to flooding, right? So how can we divert that excess water to maybe states that don't have as much water? And one of the solutions is pointing towards an interstate pipeline, but that's something we're going to get into later. But one of the other aspects that of conservation is the idea of gray water, right? That Grace Oxland from our infrastructure team had written about. And gray water is essentially household wastewater that comes from showers, laundry bath, lavatory, and untreated spa water. So gray water that has not come in contact with any like contaminants, right? It's free from fecal matter, right? It's from things that make water bad. And it is an alternative for water management. So what is this and how should Americans feeling about this? So gray water is lightly used, right? So it is an alternative for our typical desalination plants, right? Which are converting salt water into fresh water. This is recycling water that has been already used for other uses. Some people get icky at the thought of this, thinking that's pretty gross. But this water does go through a cleaning treatment, right? So when it gets put back, it's clean water. It's not contaminated, doesn't have pollutants. So it is an alternative to our water crisis that our houses can use, our businesses, our factories can use, not our agriculture sector, because they need more fresh water though. So this is mostly for like not landscaping, like factories, residential uses, which could be another alternative, but it's not something we're talking a lot about because there is fear against recycling water. But there are beer companies who are now starting to use this type of water to make their beer. You know, they're using recycled water, which is an innovation in itself, right? And people have said that it tastes the same, like as beer does. So, and it hasn't got anyone sick. So that is something that we can look towards to as the future of water infrastructure, of recycling water, cleaning it and putting it back. The listeners can always check us out at ournationalconversation.org to see what Grace Oxland has written about gray water.
Okay, so after everything that you've mentioned here, Tanya, you know, that what comes to my mind is, okay, well, let's talk about water utilities or just utilities in general. And I imagine we'll focus on water utilities. Shen, you know, you've done some research on this, so talk to us a little bit about this. You know, there's been a lot of talk about privatizing water utilities. And there's a question between, you know, going along with a capitalist structure, I guess you could say a market structure, it might promote more efficiency when it comes to water distribution. I guess you can say maybe even desalination plants one day. But would that actually be the case? Do you think that a water system should be privatized? Do you have examples of if they are privatized or if they're not in certain areas? What are the benefits and drawbacks of that? Talk to us a bit.
Of course. Thank you, Matthew.
Mhm.
So the reason why I think water utilities is an important issue or a subsection of water crisis is not because of its scale, so to speak, but its distance from our daily life, which is really no distance at all. Everyday consumers use water utilities and access them every single day. And that is why it is an issue worth investigating. So first, I'd like to talk about its scale. So, of course, the scale of water utility privatization varies from state to state. For example, in Texas, I believe it was 3 or 2% of consumers rely on private water utilities. And in Massachusetts, it's 2%, I believe. But at the same time, in Pennsylvania, it's 31%. And in Idaho, it's 40% as far as I can find. In Ohio, it's 30%. And Ohio and Pennsylvania both are very popular states. And in California, where water crisis, as you said, most pronounced, I believe 17% of total consumers use private water utilities. And on a national level, back in 2017, which was when the most recent data in this respect was collected, on a national scale, 10% of Americans rely or depend on privatized water utilities for drinking water every single day.
Some of the ones that you had mentioned that more so rely on private ones. Also, if I just made that connection quickly or mistakenly, you said in California and Pennsylvania, those are also high agricultural states, right? So are privatized water utilities catering more towards urban populations or rural populations? Is there a connection there, or what are your thoughts on that?
Of course, still data in this respect is frankly lacking. But
Mhm.
I believe privatized water utilities mostly congregate in urban areas. For example, in California, there's San Jose Water Company,
Mhm.
which is actually listed, I believe, on one of the stock exchanges as a private company, a private entity, and it runs water services in the municipality of San Jose.
Okay.
And I think a reason for that is, well, of course, urban water utilities are way more profitable. And as a result, private interests are more likely to rent or purchase water assets in more high population density areas. And this brings us to several advantages of private water utility, and they are mostly theoretical, mostly conceptual. First, of course, a private business meets competition.
Mhm.
And technically speaking, theoretically speaking, it can be more efficient in managing water assets, reduce operational costs, and basically save water more efficiently.
Right.
And if you are a city or a county government, it also has benefits. For example, if you are tight on revenues, you can always sell your water assets or the right to operate your water utilities to a private company and reap the profit. You can sell them, rent them out to basically replenish your own treasury. And this, I believe, is the primary drive behind water utilities privatization. And one very interesting statistics was collected, I believe, also back in 2016 and 17, where a lot of publications in this respect came out. So between 2006 and 2015, so during approximately 10 years' time, more than 90%, actually, I believe 90.4% of all private water utilities contracts were renewed by local governments. So it indicates a very high level of satisfaction.
That's interesting to hear that they were renewed. I'm also wondering I mean, you mentioned 2000 and what was the first year? 2000 and what was it?
2006 to 2015.
2006 to 2015. That's like right around the great financial crisis and when cities were going through some tough times. So I kind of wonder what environment or context helped that 90.4% re-sign rate. I'm kind of wondering what if there was any influence there. That's just my own kind of wonders. I always love to think of things in terms of like, okay, what's the context of the time? What's the context of this issue? And sometimes that might produce some connections here. So talk to us a little bit about now, like, okay, well, we know about the benefits of privatization, right? The increased efficiency, supposedly, theoretically, the general satisfaction with it. But of course, when it comes to with privatization and then with something as important as water, there's a loss of transparency. There's a loss of accountability. Because of course, when something is wrong under a government program, it's relatively easy to get down to the bottom and figure out what's wrong here. Whereas with at least compared to a private company that has its own rights and has its own I guess you could say, promise of privacy or right to privacy, it becomes a little more different there. Do you have anything to say about that in terms of loss of accountability, transparency? What are your thoughts?
Of course. So a more general indication of the lack of transparency actually comes from the lack of data that I just mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
So as our listeners might have noticed, all the statistics, the data that I cited came from basically 2016 and 2017. And maybe it's fault on my part, but I wasn't able to find any more recent concrete data as to how much of America's water utilities at this moment in 2022 or even 2021 were controlled or owned by private companies. So this might indicate a genuine lack in transparency of ownership data. But some of the more significant problems or disadvantages of having water utilities privatized came from other aspects. For example, contractual misdesign. For example, if I am a county government and I am renting out the water utilities that I own to a private company, in the contract, we are supposed to agree on, say, for how many years this particular company is going to run my water utilities, and if there is a cap on how much they could charge and how services are provided in a very specific fashion. So if I misdesign the contract, for example, if I give this contract to a company for 10 years, and during those 10 years, it runs a virtual monopoly on water provision within my county. So there is no competition, and privatization, and one major benefit of privatization is increased competition. So by misdesigning my contract, I basically let go of this one fantastic advantages of privatization and replace it with monopoly, under which this company could charge higher rates. And this is exactly what one of the nonprofits called the Food and Water Watch it found. So according to its research, privatized water utilities charge 59% higher than a public water utility. And this difference, I believe it was a few years back, would amount to more than $180 per year per household. So it's actually not an insignificant amount. And another problem with private water companies and water utilities is that they need to pay dividends to its shareholders, and there are corporate profits and taxes involved, taxes and profits and dividends that are non-existent within a public structure. And all those spendings could push up operational costs by 20 to 30%, and thus making it actually less efficient and less cost-effective than public water utilities.
Yeah, just on that last part here, for me, I'd like to think that I pay attention to the markets, the stock market, bonds, stocks, whatever it may be. So when I hear that there's a private company that's doing a public good, which is, allocating water, and they produce dividends, in my mind, I think to myself, that's great, because these companies are producing dividends, and their utility in a lot of, from what I understand. And if we have any listeners who are in the financial world, if I get this wrong, please call me out on it. But I'm pretty sure that, you know, when it comes to like pensioners, pensions, pension funds, or whatever, maybe 401ks, they hold quite a bit of ownership or holdings or stocks, I guess you can say, in utilities that then pay out dividends to them. So in a certain way, workers or pensioners or people, anybody who has a 401k, are benefiting from this private company producing a public good in the most efficient way. But the problem there is, like, while I see it in this circle, right, where it's the utility, the pension, and all of that, not everybody in the United States has a 401k. Not everybody in the United States has a pension. So while it is producing a good for an amount of people, I think that the vast majority of people are missing from that positive loop structure. If you can see what I'm thinking here, that there are some people who are benefiting, and this system could work, but there's a lot of people who are not included in that. That might be another conversation. That might be another podcast in itself. But yeah, so when I hear about that, that sounds great, but it sucks. From my understanding, it really sucks that there's such a large amount of people who are excluded from that group. So, you know, privatization might have potential. And I think that it has to be addressed. Like, just even the thought that I had right now has to be addressed. But whether it works or not depends on, you know, case by case privatization and contractual designs and things like that. That's what I'm getting from what you're saying, Shane. Is that correct?
Yes. So for now, if you look at media or academic research, water utilities privatization is mostly painted in a very negative light. But personally, I believe, as you said, it has to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, because privatization in itself is not a terrible thing. If it is managed contractually or administratively correctly, it can definitely have more benefits than problems. And there are a few solutions that people proposed that might be able to address these issues. So the first solution, of course, is to use shorter term contracts to avoid the building up of monopolies, to make sure that there is actually effective competition among different private companies that want to run or manage the same water utilities. Because in this case, whoever has control over said utilities will have an incentive to reduce costs, to provide high quality service, just to make sure that they won't lose out to a competitor in the next bidding, so to speak.
Right. What do you think? I think, yeah, short-term contracts definitely go into like that. That automatically sounds like a great proposal. But if you don't mind me asking, what knowledge do you have of like the contractual process here? Thinking about it in terms of like from a private business, having to take over, say, for another one who previously ran that, you know, the water supply, right? Like, let's say if Tanya ran the Tanya Water Co. company, right? And the city of San Diego decided not to renew with her, and I ran the Matthews Water Co. It would take me a while, I imagine, to sort of figure out how she did things, you know, and then try to impose or formulate my own plan to improve on that. How long does that take? You know, do you think that in itself fits into the short-term contractual process, like where it has to be a few, you know, maybe a decade or so? What are your thoughts on that?
Of course, I'm afraid I haven't done too much research into this respect, but what I can say
Yeah,
is
that was a pretty deep, like that was almost a business question. So I apologize for that, but that's what came to my mind. I was like, I wonder why are they so long? Why are contracts so long as opposed to just automatically being short? And I imagine in terms of like government, short is like 10 years probably.
of course, it's a very interesting investigation to be made.
Right.
So I believe at least a part of the problem has something to do with financial desperation on local government's part. So I assume they might be incentivized to provide longer term contracts, with which are of course in advantages of private water utilities, because the water utilities companies, they are willing to pay more
Mhm.
just to
Possibly.
address the government's financial problem. This is of course speculation, but I
Mhm.
suspect that it has something to do with the contractual nature
Right.
in this.
Well, I was just gonna say, what about public-private partnerships? I'm a big fan of those. At least in theory. What are your thoughts on public-private partnerships?
I also like public-private partnerships, and I mean, in many cases, they are fantastic for transition. Say,
Mm.
transitioning from a public-owned system to private competition or the private sphere.
Okay.
But at least recently, there are discussions of what's called public-public partnerships, or PPPs, as potential or even better replacement for private-public or public-private partnerships. And basically, a PPP is when two public agencies or two public utilities, for example, when San Jose and San Francisco water districts, both public agencies, they decide to join in as partners, and they retain a significant number of advantages offered to public-private partnerships, such as they are able to pool their resources. They will have a larger amount of capital for huge public infrastructure investments, and their expertise will be much more than any of those could single-handedly amass.
Mhm.
And they could engage in what is known as bulk buying. For example, when they need a lot of raw materials for water treatment, so to speak,
Mhm.
two water districts joining as one can negotiate much better deals than any of them could do alone.
It's like the Costco of water. You buy in bulk, you get it cheaper.
That's true, definitely.
Right.
But at the same time, they avoid some shortcomings of involving a private entity in this partnership. So they will not seek high profits. They will always have basically public welfare in mind, at least more so than a private company could ever do, many so claim. And I do agree to this point. I think as long as those two public agencies are run by the right people, they are designed correctly, and they are not, say, contaminated by private interest, they would definitely do a much better job
Mhm.
than a public-private partnership. And there are a few cases of PPPs already in place, for example, in Nashville, Tennessee, or in Miami-Dade, that is in Florida.
Mhm.
But their longer-term effects, they're way to be seen.
Yeah, so we have this norm that some are prioritized, some are not, right? There's this sort of balance, but yet our infrastructure report card still has us as a C minus, right? So do we think public private partnerships are the solution to up our grade up to make it an A if we incorporate more of these as opposed to a sort of fully privatized industry? What do we believe is the best way to improve our water infrastructural systems, like the pipes? Because a lot of our pipes in the moment, every 2 minutes, there's a pipe burst. And that's over, I don't want to say the wrong number, but I think that's like 6 million gallons of water that's gone, like fresh water that's gone. So where do we believe is the best way to improve our water infrastructural system?
I mean, I don't think water utilities or any reform in this respect could push our grade up from C minus, because if I'm to be honest and frank, water utilities can be seen as the end users in this. They do not control how water is processed or where water comes from. So, for example, in California, there is a good chance that your water actually comes from, I don't know, Nevada, somewhere in Nevada. And it is their origin, their sources that control most of the management, treatment.
We, especially us, including the utilities, are the end users. It's too difficult to do something on this part because it's like the body. You much rather make changes at the artery than make changes at all the little veins, right? Does that make sense? Okay, cool. That was great. That's a good way to look at it. Tanya, please continue.
I believe that's where my main criticism lies with this whole privatization of these utilities is that they like the money of it, but they're not really fixing the system of it. So I never really liked the idea of these privatized utilities. I've never been a fan of it, given like in Mexico, there was this privatization of water, right? And suddenly no one had water.
Hmm.
Indigenous communities were just left to dry, right? So my fear is if we push this narrative that this privatization model could be the solution, we're just going to see one higher rates, and then we're not really going to see solutions coming into improving water conservation and distribution, maybe even transportation. And then three, we're not improving our water quality,
Hmm.
right? Because again, there are so more interested in pushing out water as opposed to finding ways to improve our water systems. But this is probably out of scope for them. Maybe this is something on a federal level has to be improved in. But still, I believe if you're going to control a specific sector of like water distribution, you have to inherently want to improve the water system. And I don't see that happening. Instead, we do see counties who are trying to fight back from these privatized utilities to get their water back, but instead we see them trapped in courts, right? So they have no choice but to sign these contracts again, saying, okay, I can't pay the cost to buy out these private utilities, so I have no choice but then to sign another contract. So
Hmm.
I don't necessarily agree that they re-sign these contracts in good faith, right? I think it's more so motivated by the idea that they can buy back their own utilities, and even if they try to, again, they're stuck in court for years, or they're being told to pay upwards to 15 million to buy back their own water. So
Hmm.
this is such an interesting conservation of privatization v public private v just not doing it. I am a skeptic at heart. So it's hard for me to visualize or want a private model when I've seen how this has failed in many international, like foreign countries. Then again, we are not Mexico. Mexico is not us. Maybe we'll do it differently, but I just don't know.
Yeah, I can definitely empathize with that. Being I'm a pretty big fan of capitalism in general, but I'm also very cautious of the people who are greedy and who will, I guess you can say, choose greed over the public good. While there's, of course, there's a balance to be struck there. Some of them are more, you can make more money on it. Does it hurt the public a little bit? Yeah, but does it help in other ways? Okay. But with water, it's such a it feels like one of those rare, black and white certain kind of issues here. So I can definitely see where you're coming from here. I definitely have some stuff to learn about that. But I think part of this too, or Tanya, please go ahead if you have something else to say. Go ahead.
I was gonna say something about data, but it seems as if Shane is gonna get into that later about ownership data and really about efficiency, right? I think I'll mention efficiency because I don't think Shane's gonna get into that. There's no significant data that points that these private utilities have more efficiency as opposed to public ones, right? When that is unclear, this debate is still going to persist. So until we find a model in where we can really calculate how more effective one is versus the other, we're always going to have this debate, right? That's why I'm always going to be a skeptic, because we even have things like I think Southern California Edison Company, like you mentioned pensioners, right? One pensioner was going to receive $1,500 a month, but who was going to be paying them? It was the consumers who were coming from Edison, the people who are buying electricity from Edison, like you and I, were paying those pensioners, and they were losing so much money. The Edison Co. They were asking their consumers, "Hey, can you pay right into our retirement fund because we can't afford it?" So then you see these private utilities coming up saying, "Oh, we'll take your business." So like when you have this idea of that these public utilities can't afford a lot of things, of course you want to go transition to privatized places where these people are being paid more, and it's not hurting the consumers as much. Yes, they pay higher rates, but not as much as the Southern California Edison Co., which is really interesting. How
Mhm.
a public one can be charging more than a private one. But then you also have private ones that are charging more than public ones. So there seems to be no similarities between how a private utility operates in California as opposed in Pennsylvania, right? They're so different. So I wonder if we should have a sort of standard that like goes across the board, like a standard for these private utilities.
That was just the line of thought that I was going to go into. And I was thinking to myself, yeah, well, can we impose standards? But then the first thing that came to my mind was thinking, okay, well, what about the localization of each of these issues, right? The water issues are going to be very different for Los Angeles compared to I don't know, Portland, Oregon, or whatever it may be. So yeah, that was my train of thought too, but it ran smack in the face of, okay, well, what's the local issues here? What are the local regulations? Like that would be a very big overhaul. But then part of what you were saying, and also what Shen was saying too, in my mind was, well, I think a healthy medium, and I really hope soon that we can get a water expert or water rights expert or an infrastructure expert on here one day after listening to this podcast, because they're probably chomping at the bit. You're wrong on this, or that's a good idea. Who knows? Somebody might be listening and might like what we're saying, or might hate it so much that they'll talk to us about it. But I think that would be what would be a great thing, and it'd be a healthy middle ground between what you and Shen are saying here. Are, well, what about the Build Back Better plan? Finally, we have some billions and billions of dollars that are supposed to be allotted back to, the states or the people, I guess you can say, to rebuild our infrastructure. Because yeah, as an American, it feels a little shameful that our infrastructure is at a D or a C minus. I saw a D. You're saying C minus. Um, I don't like C minuses or Ds either, but I feel like I look around and I see a D. But then you look at a lot of other developing nations that have this beautiful infrastructure, newly built cities, and you kind of wonder, like, hey, they keep telling us that this is the best country in the world, and why is our infrastructure crumbling? So I wonder what like private and public partnerships, or even public, like Shen, you mentioned, what part they have to play here. If the Build Back Better plan was to be implemented, and they have a fund for cities or for states, whatever it may be, and if they want to tap those funds, then they have to commit to reform, or they have to commit to achieving certain standards for water or whatnot. That's just my own thoughts. That seems like it'd be great to have a policy expert and a water expert, and even maybe somebody who is attuned to the business practices of water meet for a discussion. That'd be incredible. But I think the last solution that we wanted to talk about, and I think Shen, I think you had something to say here, was enhance water utility ownership data. Or was it support water affordability, transparency, equity, and reliability, or the Water Act?
Right. So both are, as I see them, very worthy pursuits. But before that, I wanted to address what Tanya said, which are very fantastic points. So what I was trying to argue here basically is that we need to proceed, of course, with caution, but also to try implement something different in this respect. I personally do not deny, say, the potential validity of having private water utilities, but we do have to proceed with caution, with a lot of data, a lot of empirical research in hand. And this is why the lack of information, the lack of statistics is very concerning, as our Government Accountability Office, or GAO, mentioned in one of their 2021 report, I believe. Water utilities ownership data in the US is very inaccurate and outdated, which isn't surprising given that I couldn't find information relevant in 2016 or 2017.
Mm-hmm.
And as you said, Matthew, there is this Water Act, or Water Affordability, Transparency, Equity, and Reliability Act of 2021. The same act, with a few modifications, has been proposed back in 2019, I believe, but it basically fell through, and now it's again in the House. But there hasn't been any new development regarding this particular bill, and it will create a fund called the Water Fund, which would dedicate approximately $35 billion every year to improve water infrastructure, which I think is great. We do need this large amount of money to fix what we have in America at this moment. And I believe those two measures combined. So first, we have all the data we need, and then we have the money to conduct further investigation and to reform water utilities and even water pipes, dams, and other water infrastructure based on what we found, based on what we could find in our research and in our census and investigation. So I do think the next step basically is to do research, find data, even case studies of particular water companies in some localities to see how they negotiate their rates, how they negotiate their contract with local government, and to talk with the local government to see what they truly think about having their water utilities privatized. And only when we achieve all these could we reform ownership of water utilities, which of course is only a very small part of the entire water infrastructure. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is it's truly a very expensive, a very broad topic, and every single section and subsection of it requires great efforts.
Definitely. I mean, even just thinking about the process from my own personal lack of knowledge in terms of like how my local government communicates with private or public water utilities. It seems like it's done behind closed doors. We don't really know how that works. So having shedding some light on that or just increasing the public knowledge on that would be incredible. Yeah, so Shen and Tanya, thank you so much for talking to us about, the water crisis, its causes, and some of the things that we can do to tackle it. Also, just for basically increasing the public's and at least our listeners' awareness of this. Before we start to sign off, was there anything that you both felt that we might have overlooked or something that might have just come to your mind right now? If there's any last or closing remarks that you'd like to say, please do so now.
So here's my line of everything. Water sustains life. Water is a necessary part of life. There cannot be the argument that non-potable water is sufficient or something Americans ought to adopt to, right? We can't always accept the fact there's a drought. We can't always accept the fact that some counties, some states won't have clean water. We can't accept that, and we have for so long. So this discussion right here could be, it's the building block for greater discussions. We can go later into more of the solutions and how to improve everything. But I believe, especially Americans, need to understand like water is such a sensitive topic that you need to talk about it. We could talk about so many aspects in this, but just start the conversation is really beneficial. We often get stuck, again, in this normative language, like, oh, we should just get used to this drought living. No, I refuse to live in a society where we have to accept some things that we don't need to do. There's some obvious solutions like smart water technologies. There are other avenues that Shane points out, like the public-private partnerships that we could be doing instead of what we're doing right now that could improve the way we approach water in its distribution and use, right? So I just think once we enter this discussion, there's so much we could talk about, that this can be a 5-parter we make it to be, so right.
Yeah,
So I
would love
just
for it
think
to
what
be
we
5
talked
parts.
about now is the foundation, right? This is the foundational piece for the greater discussions, and I think that's a really beautiful thing.
Definitely agreed, Shen.
I do look forward to talking more and doing more research in this respect and just sharing the information and potential solutions, of course, with you all.
Of course, yeah. Well, thank you both. I mean, living in California, like you said, Tanya, Shen, I've grown up with the idea of a drought always looming over our head. I lived right at the base of the San Bernardino Mountains, which is east of Los Angeles. And it's supposed to be a desert, but you see trees and lawns and everything everywhere. And I still remember, even before I left there for the Bay Area, San Francisco, as a child, we used to always see heavy snowfall, and maybe sometime around 2012, I feel it just stopped happening. We stopped seeing as much snow, we stopped seeing as much rain, and we stopped seeing as much snowpack on those mountains. And California is heavily reliant on snowpack from the mountains melting into our rivers, into our dams, into our reservoirs, for us to to continue on in the generous California way that we do. Unfortunately, that has not happened, and it's caused a lot of consternation and angst, and further worry of water supplies, especially in California. And this is happening all over the country, whether it's less snowfall, less snowpack, less melted water, less rain in general. We're seeing drought happening all over the country, and it's even affecting the Mississippi River, which means not only are water supplies of being affected, but the Mississippi River is still one of the largest and probably the biggest waterborne artery for trade in the United States. So that not only affects our water, but that affects business up and down the Mississippi River throughout the economy. And just one final thing that I'd like to say here too, for all the talk about whether this is attributable to climate change or to whatever it may be, we don't have to call it climate change. Let's just think about it in a way that there's less water now. We want to make sure that there's more water for the next generations that come after us, for our children, grandchildren, and just for the younger generations that we may call friends that have a bit of availability for them. So just wanted to say thank you all for listening to ONC's Allow Us to Explain Infrastructure, where we took a pretty deep dive into water. I imagine that we'll expand this podcast into a series, hopefully, because water is such an important topic. There's so many things to research, whether it's just talking about water itself, whether it's talk about the economics of it, contractual issues, public-private partnerships, municipal versus private ownership. There's a lot to dig into here. So for the last, Tanya Ruiz Ortiz, who is the leader, team lead for our infrastructure team, and Zhenmao Sheng, who is also an infrastructure intern as well. Thank you both for your research. Thank you both for being here today, and can't wait to speak to you again soon. Again, this was ONC Allow Us to Explain Infrastructure podcast, and we'll see you soon.
This podcast was brought to you by Our National Conversation, a place where students generate policy solutions to the biggest problems facing America. Join us in free and political dialogue from hyperpartisanship. To learn more about what you heard today, check us out at ournationalconversation.org. You can follow us on social media at Our National Conversation to show your support and keep up with our latest efforts.